The gramophone began playing at 2:17 in the morning, although no one had touched it in 15 years. And by sunrise, Alexander Hayes had ordered every employee in the mansion to remain on the property until he learned who had awakened his mother's final song. I knew the answer before he entered the music room, because I had repaired the machine 6 hours earlier, yet the melody pouring from its brass horn was not the record I had tested. The tune drifting through the corridor belonged to my childhood, a private arrangement my father used to hum while working alone after midnight, and hearing it inside a stranger's locked estate made every careful explanation feel suddenly inadequate. When Alexander appeared in the doorway, his gray eyes moved from the spinning turntable to the open cabinet, then settled on the small brass key lying beside my tools. I had never seen that key before, and neither had anyone else, but 3 initials engraved into its stem matched the letters my father once claimed our family had buried for a reason. Before Alexander asked who had repaired the gramophone, I understood that the machine had not merely started playing again. It had opened a question someone had spent decades trying to keep closed. I had arrived at the Hayes estate 11 days earlier as an independent conservator, hired to restore antique furniture, mechanical clocks, and neglected heirlooms before the mansion's historical wing underwent appraisal. The house stood above the Massachusetts coast, like a monument built against weather, its dark cedar shingles silvered by salt, and its long windows facing an Atlantic that never seemed fully at rest. Most employees treated me politely, although I recognized the familiar pause that came when strangers noticed my body before they noticed the credentials attached to my name. I had learned not to waste energy resenting that pause, because damaged objects were far more honest than people. Wood revealed pressure, brass revealed neglect, and gears revealed exactly where someone had forced what should have been understood. My father had taught me that principle in a workshop behind our modest home, where I spent childhood weekends sorting screws, cleaning springs, and listening to broken machines explain themselves through resistance. He died 3 years earlier, leaving me his tools, several unpaid invoices, and one instruction that never made sense until the night the gramophone played. The music room occupied the eastern corner of the second floor, although no one used it except a housekeeper who opened the curtains every Monday and dusted without moving anything. Eleanor Hayes, Alexander's mother, had once filled the room with private concerts, handwritten arrangements, and artists who preferred conversation to publicity. After her death, the gramophone stopped working during a memorial gathering, and 3 respected restoration firms declared the internal mechanism too damaged to save without replacing most original parts. Alexander refused replacement, then covered the machine and left the room unchanged. When I first examined it, I found no catastrophic damage, only a governor spring with the wrong tension and a speed linkage installed backward during an earlier repair. Someone had restored its appearance while misunderstanding its design, which meant the machine had been silenced by expertise performed without humility. I corrected the mechanism using original tolerances, cleaned hardened lubricant from the gear assembly, and tested 1 commercial violin recording before covering the cabinet again. The machine worked perfectly, yet nothing explained why it later played a melody that did not exist on the record I had chosen. When Alexander reached the gramophone, he lifted the needle before the final phrase and demanded an explanation without raising his voice. His calm carried more force than anger, because everyone in the room understood he was not asking about property damage. I admitted repairing the mechanism, described the reverse linkage, then told him the music had changed after I left. The maintenance supervisor looked offended, the housekeeper crossed herself, and the butler quietly insisted no one had entered the room after midnight. Alexander ignored their reactions and asked how I knew the melody. I told him my father had called it the workshop song, although he never explained where he learned it. For several seconds, Alexander said nothing. Then he opened a locked drawer beneath a framed photograph of Eleanor and removed a thin book of handwritten musical arrangements. He turned to a page dated 32 years earlier and placed it beside the turntable. The notes matched the melody exactly, including a strange descending phrase my father always repeated twice. Eleanor had written 1 sentence beneath the title, "For Elias," until George is ready to hear the rest." My father's name was George. The room seemed to contract around us while Alexander read the sentence again, searching my face as though I might possess an explanation I had deliberately withheld. I told him my father never mentioned Eleanor, the Hayes family, or anyone named Elias, but Alexander's expression suggested the name carried history. Elias Whitmore had been a celebrated mechanical artisan who built custom music machines for wealthy collectors before disappearing from public life after a workshop fire. Eleanor had supported his work anonymously, although Alexander knew almost nothing about the arrangement, because his mother believed generosity should never become family mythology. According to estate records, Elias had delivered the gramophone personally and refused payment beyond the cost of materials. I reached for the brass key, careful not to touch it until Alexander gave permission, then noticed fresh dust around a narrow seam near the cabinet base. The key had not been left on the table by accident. It had fallen from a concealed compartment, disturbed when the machine began vibrating again. Using a wooden probe, I released a hidden panel beneath the carved walnut trim. Inside rested an empty linen pouch, a faded photograph, and a sealed envelope addressed not to Eleanor, Alexander, or Elias, but to George Bennett and the daughter he must never allow the Hayes family to find. Alexander read the line over my shoulder, then stepped back as though the room had shifted beneath him. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately, including the long downward stroke he used whenever he felt angry or afraid. The envelope remained sealed, but one sentence had been written across the back in darker ink. "If the gramophone plays again, someone has broken the promise." Alexander wanted the envelope opened immediately, but I refused until we could examine the paper without destroying whatever evidence time had preserved. His impatience was understandable, yet the message had survived 3 decades inside a compartment designed by a master craftsman, and ripping it open under emotional pressure would have repeated the exact arrogance that once silenced the machine. I carried the envelope to my temporary conservation room, documented its condition, photographed the seal, and placed it beneath filtered humidity for controlled relaxation. Alexander remained nearby, watching every movement with the tense discipline of a man accustomed to decisions happening when he gave an order. When I asked whether waiting challenged him, he admitted that uncertainty did, especially when it involved his mother. I told him uncertainty was not emptiness. It was simply truth before enough evidence arrived. The faded photograph from the compartment offered the first evidence. Eleanor stood beside a younger Elias inside a modest workshop, while my father, barely 20, leaned over the unfinished gramophone cabinet. Another woman appeared at the edge of the frame, partially turned away, holding an infant wrapped in a pale blanket. Her face had been scratched from the photograph with deliberate force, but a silver bracelet remained visible around her wrist. I had seen that bracelet only once, inside a sealed box my father kept beneath his bed. After his death, I found it beside my birth certificate and a note requesting that I never search for the woman who wore it. At the time, grief made obedience easier than curiosity, so I placed everything inside a bank box and tried to forget. Alexander examined the photograph without touching it and asked whether the infant could have been me. The timing was possible, although several details contradicted the life story my father had told. I had always believed I was born in Vermont after he left apprenticeship work to care for me alone. The photograph was taken at Whitmore's Massachusetts workshop, and the date written on its border was 3 weeks after my recorded birth. Either my father had lied about where we lived, or the child belonged to someone else. Alexander suggested retrieving my documents, but I resisted because the message on the envelope warned him not to find me, and I needed to understand whether that warning protected me from his family or protected his family from me. We searched estate inventories while the envelope stabilized. Eleanor's private ledgers contained regular payments to Whitmore's workshop, yet every entry had been categorized as preservation grants rather than personal commissions. One payment, issued shortly before the photograph was taken, was nearly 20 times larger than the others and labeled only continuation agreement. Alexander had never seen the ledger because it remained inside a locked archive transferred from his mother's attorney after her death. He recognized the attorney's name, Charles Vale, who still served as trustee of the Hayes Charitable Foundation and controlled access to several family records. When Alexander called him, Charles answered warmly until he heard my father's name, then claimed poor reception and ended the call. That reaction changed the investigation from family history into active concealment. Before Alexander could contact him again, the estate's appraisal director arrived unexpectedly and requested immediate access to the music room. His name was Malcolm Reed, a polished historian hired by the foundation to catalog items before a proposed museum partnership. Malcolm had repeatedly discouraged me from spending time on the gramophone, insisting its mechanical condition did not justify further expense. When he noticed the open cabinet and the missing compartment panel, his composure faltered for less than a second, but the pause was enough. He asked whether anything valuable had been discovered, emphasizing financial value rather than historical significance. Alexander replied that nothing had been removed, then ordered the room locked and placed security personnel outside. Malcolm protested that delaying appraisal could jeopardize the museum agreement. Yet Alexander reminded him that every artifact remained private property until the family approved transfer. The argument exposed another complication. The gramophone was scheduled to leave the estate in 48 hours, under a donation contract Charles had negotiated. Once transferred, the museum would gain custody, restoration authority, and legal control over hidden materials discovered afterward. Someone had arranged the donation immediately before hiring me, perhaps assuming the machine would remain silent and the compartment undiscovered. My repair had disrupted a timeline already moving toward completion. The envelope became safe to open shortly before evening. I separated the seal with a microspatula while Alexander stood across the table, his attention fixed on my hands. Inside were 2 letters, one written by my father and another by Eleanor, along with a narrow strip of perforated paper resembling an early player piano roll. My father's letter began with an apology to the daughter he feared might someday read it. He wrote that Elias had discovered falsified ownership records involving several commissioned machines, including the Hayes gramophone, and that someone inside the foundation had used Eleanor's charitable grants to hide private asset transfers. George agreed to preserve copies of the evidence, but when Elias's workshop burned, he believed the scheme had become dangerous. The letter never accused Eleanor. Instead, it claimed she had helped George escape, with an infant whose mother had disappeared after threatening to expose the records. My father wrote that the child carried no Hayes inheritance, no secret fortune, and no claim to the estate, yet certain people might still use her existence to discredit Eleanor. He raised the child under a new family history because safety required distance from every name connected to the workshop. The final paragraph identified the child, Grace Bennett. My hands began trembling, not because I had discovered wealth or status, but because the only parent I trusted had constructed my childhood around a threat he never explained. Alexander moved closer, then stopped before touching me, allowing me to choose whether comfort would feel welcome. I read Eleanor's letter next, expecting answers, yet found a warning addressed to my father. Charles knows the child survived, and he believes the missing roll can prove who ordered the fire. Before we could examine the perforated strip, the estate's fire alarm erupted, followed by the smell of smoke rising from the archive corridor below us. Alexander called emergency services while I sealed the letters inside a fire-resistant document case, but the alarm system reported 3 different locations in rapid succession, suggesting deliberate activation rather than an accidental electrical fault. Security cameras showed no flames inside the main residence, although smoke had begun filling the archive corridor from a locked records room connected to the foundation offices. Malcolm's access badge appeared in the electronic log less than 4 minutes before the alarm, yet security staff could not locate him anywhere on the property. Alexander ordered the exterior gates closed, then asked me to remain in the conservation room while he checked the archive. I refused, because my father's letter had spent 30 years warning me about other people deciding what I could safely know. The smoke came from archival boxes burning inside a metal disposal cart, carefully positioned beneath a sprinkler sensor that had been disabled. Someone intended to destroy selected records without damaging the surrounding mansion, which meant the fire was not panic, it was editing. Alexander and the security chief extinguished the flames before they spread, but several folders had already been reduced to wet ash. I recognized one surviving label from the estate ledger. Continuation Agreement, 1991. Another damaged box contained insurance files connected to Whitmore's workshop fire. The destruction confirmed that someone still feared the old records, but it also exposed urgency. Whoever staged the fire believed we had learned enough to threaten something that remained valuable in the present. Malcolm's vehicle was gone, although the gate system showed no departure because someone had manually overridden the Western Service entrance. Alexander called Charles again and received no answer. He then contacted Detective Lena Ortiz, a state investigator specializing in cultural property fraud, whom he knew through a previous theft case. Lena arrived before midnight, reviewed the letters, and immediately rejected the assumption that the mystery concerned only family secrets. The perforated strip was not a music roll. It was an encoded mechanical ledger used by Whitmore to store sequences inside custom machines. Each hole represented a number, date, or letter depending on the calibration wheel paired with it. Without the original wheel, the strip appeared meaningless, but Elias had designed mechanisms capable of reading such patterns through speed changes. The gramophone's reverse linkage suddenly mattered differently. Someone had installed it backward not through incompetence, but to prevent the governor from reaching a specific speed sequence. My repair restored the machine's ability to read the strip. The melody it played at 2:17 had not come from the record. It had been generated through hidden pins inside the turntable assembly responding to the perforations. My father's workshop song was therefore not merely a private melody. It was a decoding pattern he taught me so deeply that I recognized it without understanding its purpose. We returned to the music room under Lena's supervision and examined the underside of the turntable. 4 removable brass pins corresponded to notes in the melody, while tiny numbers engraved beneath them matched dates from Eleanor's ledger. By aligning the perforated strip along the governor plate and turning the crank at controlled intervals, I translated the sequence into a series of archive references. Most pointed to objects already donated through the Hayes Foundation during Charles's tenure. Several paintings, clocks, and mechanical boxes had been transferred at dramatically undervalued estimates, then resold through private collectors after museums quietly deaccessioned them. The charitable program had become a laundering route for cultural property, using Eleanor's reputation to legitimize transactions she never approved. Alexander absorbed the evidence with visible anger, although the betrayal cut deeper than money. Charles had served beside his family for decades, guided him after his mother's death, and repeatedly praised Eleanor's commitment to public history. If the records were genuine, he had converted her generosity into a machine for private theft, while convincing Alexander that aggressive oversight would disrespect her intentions. Grace recognized the pattern from restoration work. Damage often survived longest when disguised as preservation. Lena warned that encoded references alone would not prove criminal ownership, especially after the archive fire destroyed original agreements. We needed surviving objects, transfer records, or testimony connecting Charles to the scheme. Eleanor's letter mentioned the missing roll, but the strip in our possession appeared incomplete because its final edge had been cut cleanly. Another section existed somewhere, possibly containing names rather than transactions. My father may have kept it, which meant the bank box I had avoided for years had become evidence. We drove to the regional bank shortly after dawn, accompanied by Lena and one uniformed officer. Inside my father's box were the silver bracelet, my original hospital identification band, several photographs, and a small wooden cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. The cylinder contained the missing portion of the perforated strip, along with a calibration wheel engraved by Elias. Beneath it rested a cassette recording labeled "For Grace," when silence becomes more dangerous than truth. The bank provided a private room with an old tape player recovered from storage. My father's voice emerged through static, older and more frightened than I remembered, explaining that my mother, Rebecca Bell, had worked as a bookkeeper for Whitmore's workshop. She discovered Charles was falsifying grants, purchasing insured machines through shell buyers, and arranging the fire to erase ownership records after Elias threatened exposure. Rebecca copied documents onto the encoded roll, then disappeared before she could testify. George believed Charles had killed her, although he lacked proof, and feared the authorities protecting the foundation would return me to people connected to the Hayes name. Then my father revealed the part he had hidden even from Eleanor. Rebecca had survived the fire and contacted him years later, claiming she had obtained evidence strong enough to imprison Charles. She demanded money before surrendering it, then vanished again after George refused to involve me. His final instruction was not to search for her unless the original hospital band contained a second name. I examined the faded plastic band under Lena's flashlight. Beneath Grace Bell, written in smaller letters almost erased by age, appeared the emergency contact listed at my birth, Rebecca Vale. Charles was not merely connected to my mother. He was her older brother. The revelation changed every assumption surrounding my childhood, because Charles was no longer a distant trustee hiding financial crimes. He was my uncle, the man my father believed capable of harming his own sister to protect them. Lena cautioned that family connection did not establish murder, yet it explained why Eleanor's letter warned that Charles knew I had survived. If Rebecca had disappeared after gathering evidence, Charles may have spent decades monitoring George through foundation records while waiting for the encoded roll to resurface. Hiring me at the estate could therefore have been accidental, or it could have been the final stage of a plan designed by someone who knew exactly what skills my father had given me. Alexander contacted the staffing agency that referred me and learned Malcolm had personally requested a conservator trained in mechanical music devices. He claimed the gramophone required routine assessment before donation, despite earlier reports declaring it beyond repair. My professional profile mentioned my father's workshop, but not his apprenticeship under Elias. Someone with access to historical records could have connected us. Malcolm may have expected me to open the compartment, identify the roll, and unknowingly reveal where the missing section had been kept. A message arrived on my phone before noon from an unknown number containing a photograph of Rebecca taken within the past week. She appeared older, seated beside a motel window, holding the same silver bracelet now lying on the bank table. The message instructed me to bring both roll sections to an abandoned preservation warehouse outside New Bedford if I wanted to hear the truth from her directly. Lena immediately identified the demand as leverage and advised controlled contact, but the photograph included details impossible to fabricate from public records. Rebecca wore a small scar above her left eyebrow, matching one visible in the scratched workshop photograph where her face had not been completely removed. Alexander wanted police to manage the meeting without involving me, and his protective instinct ignited the first real conflict between us. I understood the danger, yet I refused to spend another day allowing powerful families, frightened fathers, or well-intentioned men to determine which truths I could survive. He argued that courage did not require walking willingly into a trap. I replied that protection became another form of control when it removed the person most affected from the decision. The word struck him harder than I intended, perhaps because his family had built its public identity around deciding what history others were allowed to see. Lena offered a compromise. I would attend wearing a concealed transmitter while officers secured the surrounding property, and the original roll would remain locked in evidence. We created a convincing replica using archival scans, then placed a tracking filament inside its wooden case. Alexander insisted on accompanying the operation, but agreed to remain outside the warehouse perimeter. Before we separated, he apologized without defending himself. He said fear had made him speak as though authority gave him better judgment than the person living inside the consequences. I accepted the apology because it changed his behavior, not because the words were elegant. The warehouse had once stored museum exhibits awaiting conservation, but years of neglect had left broken windows, rusted rails, and shelving coated in salt dust from the nearby harbor. Rebecca stood alone beneath a hanging work light, older than the woman in the photograph, but unmistakably connected to my face. She studied me with neither warmth nor surprise, then asked whether George had told me she was dead. I said he had told me she disappeared, which seemed to wound her more than accusation might have. She claimed she fled because Charles threatened to expose George as the thief behind the foundation scheme and place me in state custody. According to Rebecca, Elias died believing the workshop fire was accidental, while Eleanor helped George escape only after discovering Charles's falsified records. I asked why she stayed away after the danger passed, and Rebecca's answer revealed a selfishness no tragic explanation could erase. She had spent years collecting proof, bargaining with journalists, private attorneys, and federal contacts, always believing one more document would finally make returning safe. Over time, the investigation became easier to pursue than the daughter she had abandoned. Shame turned into delay, delay became identity, and eventually she convinced herself that George could give me a cleaner life without her. Her honesty did not earn forgiveness, but it prevented the scene from collapsing into a comforting lie. Rebecca demanded the role because it contained the only surviving sequence identifying the shell buyers Charles controlled. She had recently learned Malcolm planned to transfer the gramophone and destroy the decoding mechanism after the museum donation. She sent the envelope from the hidden compartment through an estate employee loyal to Eleanor's memory, hoping my repair would trigger the melody and force Alexander to investigate. She denied setting the archive fire and warned that Malcolm had become desperate after discovering Charles intended to sacrifice him if authorities reopened the case. A metallic crash sounded above us, followed by Malcolm's voice through the warehouse speaker system. He had followed the tracking signal embedded in the replica, believing it belonged to the original roll. Steel shutters dropped across the exits, while smoke began entering through ventilation ducts. He accused Rebecca of keeping evidence for 30 years only to sell protection to the highest bidder, then announced that everyone inside would die in an electrical fire blamed on the building's decayed wiring. Rebecca pulled a small revolver from her coat, but I stopped her from firing blindly toward the catwalk. Violence would give Malcolm exactly the chaos he needed. Instead, I studied the warehouse's antique freight elevator, whose manual governor used the same mechanical principles my father taught me. The smoke system drew power from a temporary generator connected through the elevator control panel. If I reversed the governor linkage, the motor would overload the emergency circuit and release the fire shutters. Rebecca stared at me as I opened the rusted housing with tools from my bag. "George taught you well," she whispered. "No," I replied, forcing the seized linkage into alignment without damaging the brake. "He taught me patiently. What I do with that lesson belongs to me." The circuit failed with a heavy snap. The shutters rose 12 inches, and Lena's officers forced their way inside. Malcolm ran toward the upper loading bay, but Alexander appeared at the opposite stairwell after ignoring the order to remain outside. He did not chase him. He closed the only exit and stood between Malcolm and the harbor platform until officers made the arrest. As Lena secured the warehouse, Rebecca reached inside her coat and removed a sealed microfilm cartridge containing bank transfers, insurance correspondence, and one recorded statement Eleanor had made shortly before her death. The evidence could expose Charles completely, but Rebecca refused to surrender it until prosecutors guaranteed immunity for her own involvement in hiding documents. I looked at the mother I had spent a lifetime imagining and finally understood that survival had not made her noble. It had simply kept her alive long enough to choose what kind of person she would become next. Lena refused to negotiate immunity inside an unsecured warehouse, although she promised Rebecca the evidence would be evaluated separately from her cooperation. Rebecca reacted with bitterness, claiming institutions had failed her once and would gladly use her again. But I reminded her that mistrust could explain hiding without giving her the right to control everyone else's truth. My father had protected me through silence and paid for that choice with loneliness. Eleanor protected the Hayes name through discretion and unknowingly gave Charles decades of cover. Rebecca had protected evidence until possession became power. Every adult in the story believed secrecy served love, justice, or survival, yet the people who inherited those secrets carried the damage. Rebecca surrendered the microfilm only after I told her I would not build a relationship around bargaining. She could cooperate because it was right, or keep running and lose the possibility of knowing me without being chased. The choice broke something in her expression, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the exhausted woman beneath years of strategy. She placed the cartridge in Lena's evidence bag and asked whether George had been happy. I answered truthfully that he had loved me fiercely, worked too much, laughed rarely after midnight, and never stopped listening for threats he refused to name. Rebecca closed her eyes, accepting grief she had postponed until it could no longer be useful. The microfilm established that Charles created shell foundations to purchase historically significant objects using grant money, insured them at inflated values, then arranged controlled damage, fraudulent restoration claims, and private resale. Whitmore's workshop fire destroyed original provenance records after Elias resisted transferring ownership. Rebecca had copied correspondence, proving Charles ordered Malcolm's predecessor to remove flammable solvents from safety storage and disable the rear alarm. The evidence supported arson conspiracy, but not murder, because Elias survived the fire and died months later from illness. The crime Rebecca feared most had never occurred exactly as imagined, yet Charles had allowed that fear to spread because frightened witnesses were easier to control. Eleanor's recorded statement carried the deepest emotional consequence. She admitted discovering portions of the scheme shortly before Alexander's father became ill, but she delayed public exposure because Charles threatened to implicate the Hayes Foundation and destroy scholarships supporting hundreds of students. She chose private recovery over prosecution, forcing Charles to return several objects while leaving the larger operation intact. In the recording, she confessed that protecting the institution had become indistinguishable from protecting its reputation. She asked whoever found the statement to choose differently, even if the truth damaged everything bearing her name. Alexander listened alone before sharing the recording with investigators. He could have limited access through family attorneys, challenged the chain of custody, or negotiated a quiet settlement preserving the estate. Instead, he authorized Lena to release foundation records and suspended every museum transfer connected to Charles. He also announced an independent provenance review, knowing collectors might sue, donors might withdraw, and the historical wing could lose most of its celebrated collection. When advisors warned that public exposure would destroy Eleanor's legacy, Alexander answered that a legacy requiring hidden victims deserved correction more than protection. Charles was arrested at Boston Logan Airport while preparing to board a flight to Lisbon. He denied knowledge of the warehouse fire, blamed Malcolm for the archival destruction, and described Rebecca as an unstable extortionist. His attorney argued the records were too old, fragmented, and contaminated by personal grievance, but the encoded roll connected transactions across decades with mechanical precision. Each perforation matched an object: grant, insurance claim, and shell buyer. Elias had designed the ledger so no single page could be altered without breaking the sequence. The craftsman Charles, dismissed as old-fashioned, had built evidence capable of surviving every modern lie. Malcolm accepted a cooperation agreement and admitted arranging my employment under Charles's direction. Their original plan was to let me restore the gramophone, locate the hidden roll, then transfer the machine to a controlled museum where the evidence could disappear during conservation. The archive fire became necessary only after Alexander discovered my father's letter. Malcolm denied intending to kill anyone at the warehouse, claiming the smoke system was meant to frighten us into surrendering the roll. Lena found fuel accelerants along the exits, making that defense difficult to believe. Rebecca faced charges for withholding evidence, attempted extortion, and unlawful firearm possession, although prosecutors considered her cooperation and the coercion documented in Charles's threats. I visited her once before the hearing, not because forgiveness had arrived, but because I needed to separate truth from the fantasy I had carried since childhood. She apologized without asking me to call her mother, which mattered more than tears would have. She said George deserved the life of parenthood she abandoned, and she would accept whatever relationship I chose, including none. I told her that forgiveness was not the same as restoration. Some relationships could not return to an original state because no safe original state had ever existed. They could only be rebuilt from honest materials, slowly, without demanding that damage disappear. Rebecca nodded, recognizing my father's language inside my own. Weeks later, Alexander and I stood in the emptied historical wing while appraisers removed objects with disputed ownership. Blank spaces covered the walls, display cases stood open, and donors complained that the estate looked diminished. Alexander admitted the silence frightened him because he had inherited a house full of proof that his family mattered. I told him emptiness could become evidence too, especially when it showed where borrowed honor had once been displayed as possession. He looked toward the music room, where the gramophone remained under legal hold. "What happens when the investigation ends?" he asked. "We decide what the room is for," I answered. "Not what it used to prove." Alexander smiled faintly, then asked whether I would help him build something honest from what remained. 1 year after Charles's conviction, the Hayes estate reopened without the private museum wing that had once impressed donors and intimidated visitors. More than 40 objects were returned to families, regional archives, and institutions able to document rightful ownership, while several empty display cases remained intentionally visible with plaques explaining what had been removed and why. Alexander resisted pressure to replace the collection with expensive acquisitions, arguing that repair without memory would become another form of erasure. The estate established an independent center for provenance research, mechanical conservation, and ethical restoration, funded through the sale of disputed family assets rather than charitable donations carrying hidden expectations. I accepted the position of director only after negotiating full authority over educational programs, hiring, and public access. Alexander agreed without inserting himself into daily decisions, although learning that restraint required effort from both of us. He had spent his life treating responsibility as control, while I had spent mine treating independence as proof that I needed nothing from anyone. Working together exposed those habits more effectively than romance ever could. We disagreed about budgets, accessibility, donor influence, and whether preserving a damaged object sometimes meant displaying the damage rather than making it beautiful again. The gramophone became the center's first permanent teaching piece after investigators released it from evidence. We preserved the concealed compartment, displayed copies of the encoded roll, and created an interactive demonstration explaining how Elias transformed mechanical rhythm into an unalterable ledger. Visitors could hear Eleanor's arrangement, study George's tools, and read excerpts from the letters without turning private pain into entertainment. Alexander insisted my father receive equal recognition beside Eleanor and Elias, while I insisted Rebecca's role also appear, including her courage, failures, and years of harmful silence. History became dishonest whenever it edited people into saints or monsters for emotional convenience. Rebecca served 18 months under a reduced sentence followed by supervised release. We exchanged letters before meeting again, and those letters contained no declarations of instant healing. She answered questions about my birth, George's fear, and her choices without blaming youth for everything. I told her about my childhood workshop, the birthdays she missed, the years I believed abandonment proved something unworthy in me. Sometimes her replies helped, while other times they reopened anger I had mistaken for completion. Our relationship remained unfinished, yet unfinished no longer meant hopeless. Alexander faced a different reckoning. Several foundation trustees sued him for releasing confidential records. 2 major donors withdrew support, and newspapers questioned whether the Hayes name deserved continued influence. He testified in civil hearings, acknowledged Eleanor's delayed action, and refused to describe the family as victims of Charles's deception. That refusal cost him allies who preferred innocence over accountability, but it earned trust from employees who had watched powerful people avoid consequences for years. He learned that leadership did not always preserve institutions. Sometimes it dismantled the parts that had survived by making honesty expensive. On the anniversary of the night the gramophone played, the center hosted its first apprenticeship exhibition. Students from local trade schools demonstrated clock repair, paper conservation, cabinet making, and mechanical music restoration. One young woman stood near the gramophone explaining governor balance to visitors who initially addressed their technical questions to the older man beside her. She corrected them without apology, and I recognized a version of myself that had learned confidence earlier than I did. My father would have loved her, not because she repeated his methods, but because she understood the dignity of careful work. After the guests left, evening settled across the coastline, and the music room returned to the quiet that had once felt abandoned. Alexander entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, a tradition that had grown without either of us naming it. He placed one beside me, then looked toward the gramophone while the Atlantic darkened beyond the windows. We had eaten dinner together many times during the year, although neither of us rushed to define what developed between us. Attraction existed, but so did grief, responsibility, and the knowledge that gratitude could easily be mistaken for love if neither person remained honest. Alexander wound the gramophone halfway, then stopped before lowering the needle. "May I ask you something without turning it into another obligation?" he said. I smiled, because the question revealed how much he had changed. "You may ask." He told me he wanted to invite me to dinner away from the estate, without attorneys, trustees, conservation reports, or family history sitting between us. He did not promise simplicity, because our lives had proven that promises of uncomplicated happiness were often disguised forms of denial. He offered only honesty, patience, and the willingness to hear an answer that might disappoint him. I looked at the man who once believed protecting history meant controlling access to it, then considered the woman I had been when I arrived, carrying expertise like armor and refusing to admit how deeply my father's silence had shaped me. Neither of us had been restored into flawless versions of ourselves. We had become more truthful versions, which was harder and far more valuable. "I would like dinner," I said, "but I have one condition." Alexander raised an eyebrow. I expected at least 3. No secret investigations, no deciding what I can handle, and no expensive restaurant where the staff knows your order before I sit down. That sounds suspiciously like 3 conditions. I laughed, and the sound felt natural inside a room that had once held only other people's memories. "Then you should listen carefully when a conservator counts." He lowered the needle, and Eleanor's melody filled the room, no longer carrying threat or secrecy. The notes still contained loss, but they also carried the lives that continued, because one craftsman preserved evidence. One frightened father taught his daughter patiently. One flawed woman finally surrendered control, and one heir chose truth over reputation. Before leaving, I opened the gramophone's hidden compartment one final time. Inside rested no envelope, no encoded roll, and no warning meant for a future child. I placed my father's smallest wooden-handled screwdriver inside, not as a secret, but as a promise for the next apprentice who might someday discover it. Beside the tool, I added a simple note. "Listen before you touch, tell the truth before silence becomes comfortable, and never confuse restoration with pretending nothing was broken." Alexander read the words over my shoulder, then closed the panel gently. Outside, the Atlantic continued striking the cliffs with patient force, wearing down what could not endure and polishing what remained. I understood then that inheritance was never limited to blood, money, property, or names carved into brass. We inherit the truths people protect, the fears they refuse to face, and the choices they leave unfinished. What becomes of that inheritance is the first thing that truly belongs to us.